install and configure vCenter Server. All right, so we've gotten through the first couple of, I guess, introductory nuggets at this point. Now we're getting on to the first set of nuggets that, well, we really actually get to click through and see how things actually work. So to get this whole process started, really one of the first things that we're going to want to do is get that vCenter server up and operational. Doing so requires a set of steps, as you can see down here at the bottom. We've got to install it into, in our case, a virtual machine and size its database, give it the right license information. Once we're done with the server portion, then we'll use that portion to download the vCenter client, because the vCenter client actually is a download from the vCenter server's website. And then once we're in the vCenter client, we'll just kind of poke around in there, take a look at some of the client plugins, and just see how they look. There is actually another type of vCenter server called the vCenter Web Client and Web Server that we'll take a look at here in this nugget as well. Now, before we actually get into doing that, click-through installation piece, there are a couple of discussion topics here that are important for you to know, not only for the exam, but also for just making the right decisions when it comes time to actually, figure out what it is you want to put together to build your own vCenter environment. The two topics I have up here, number one, are to identify what are the available server editions that you can pick up. And it's very important because some of those server editions have some pretty important limitations that are associated with them. The other of which is to understand how you might actually add technologies to your vCenter server to increase its availability. Now, as you'll find out here in just a second, there are some newer features within vCenter server that really make these high availability options important. The most important of which here is this auto deploy technology here for ESXi. We won't be talking about auto deploy for a fairly long time, but be aware at this point though that if you do intend on auto deploying ESXi servers using vCenter server, well, that actually adds in some pretty significant availability requirements for vCenter server itself. Now, before we get there, however, let's back up just a minute and talk about the editions. You can see I've put up here the three different editions that are available for vCenter Server 5. There is an Essentials edition, a Foundation edition, and then also the regular Standard edition. And as you can see here by the descriptions, the Essentials and the Foundation editions are relatively the same. The only difference really is the fact, and in terms of how you would actually acquire vCenter servers. You can see here up at the top, vCenter Server Essentials provides the same features as Foundation, but it's achieved or acquired through either the Essentials or Essentials Plus kits. So you're going to find this as part of one of the kits that you buy that includes some other components. Now, vCenter Server Foundation is, you could call it kind of the light version of vCenter Server Standard. It provides tools for smaller environments that are looking to rapidly provision, monitor, and control virtual machines. Now, the important part here is the fact that vCenter Server Foundation is designed for use for up to 3 vSphere hosts. So, can be very important there. Can be fairly limiting there if you're not careful. Really, the majority of us will be making use of vCenter Server Standard. These are those of us that are not in smaller environments. A vCenter Server Standard provides, as it says here, large-scale management of vSphere deployments for rapid provisioning, monitoring, orchestration, control, all the functionality that you commonly associate with vCenter Server. Now, vCenter Server itself it's mainly the logic that you interact with from the client, but operating vCenter Server has to have a database as well, and so you'll be choosing a database, and in our case, for the purposes of this demo, we'll be choosing SQL Server Express. But there are a number of databases that you can choose for the support of the data that vCenter Server needs to collect. And which database you choose is going to have a lot to do with the different availability options down here on the bottom that you have available to you. Now, you don't necessarily need to add in high availability to your vCenter server. Having multiple vCenter servers is not a complete and absolute requirement for your environment. However, it can be a good idea. Now, obviously the first availability option up here is for you to just simply do nothing and just host a single vCenter server. This is, as I said, a completely legitimate option for many environments because, as the first bullet point says, many vCenter operations will continue to function even without a functioning vCenter server. Your HA, for example, is just going to keep operating. Your virtual machines are not going to automatically shut down if for some reason vCenter server goes down. So having it in a highly available configuration is not completely important. It can be important, however, as I said before, if you're using that ESXi auto deploy functionality, because with this auto deploy functionality, as you'll find out a little bit later, you have to have the vCenter server there in order for the ESXi hosts to be able to boot. Now, if you do that, there are a couple of different options available for you, and these are the ones that are available as VMware suggests in what their level of support is, so their supportability document. A couple of different options for you. Number one, let's say you lose that vCenter server and its database is somewhere else. Well, it is entirely feasible for you to just simply rebuild the server and reattach to the database whenever you should experience a problem. So that's not really a high availability option, but that is an option for you should you have some sort of catastrophic loss of your vCenter server itself. Now, that does nothing to the database. If you lose the database, well, then you've definitely got a problem. And so clustering that database using any sort of available clustering functionality, whether that be Oracle clustering or Microsoft Cluster Services, Windows failover clustering, whatever the database clustering solution it is that you have available for your database platform, is a solution that can bring high availability to the database. Now, VMware's recommended practice is to install vCenter into a virtual machine. This is somewhat different than how it was a couple of different versions ago when VMware actually recommended keeping vCenter as a physical computer. Now, back in version 4.0, I think it was, VMware started to really recognize the value and the power, really, of having vCenter in a virtual machine. As a virtual machine, you can take that vCenter server and make it HA enabled. So when the host that's running your vCenter server dies, your vCenter server can automatically reboot onto another host, and it's back up and operational within just a few minutes. If you do this, you are going to have a little bit better of an availability solution than would you if it were on a physical computer. Obviously, if you lose the physical computer, you got a big problem. If you do make this an HA-enabled VM, it's VMware's recommendation to give that specific VM a high restart policy so that it is amongst the first virtual machines to get rebooted after any kind of problems occur. Now, really, the road down which VMware wants you to go, the important technology that they want you to implement is this thing called VMware vCenter Server Heartbeat. And Server Heartbeat is an additional technology. It is there's a cost associated with it, and so you would actually have to purchase this technology and add it to your environment. What Server Heartbeat does is it effectively, I'll call it clusters, the entirety of what vCenter Server provides. So with vCenter Server Heartbeat, you essentially get multiple instances of vCenter Server, and all of them now operate in such a way that you can lose them and still maintain the vCenter Server environment. Again, this is an added cost there, but it is VMware's recommended way of adding high availability to vCenter Server. In our environment today, we're not going to worry too much about the high availability options. What we're really going to put our time into is just getting vCenter Server up and operational in that virtual machine so that we can begin the process of bringing in ESX hosts and lighting up virtual machines and all the things that we need to do to get our VMware environment up and operational. So let's spend the rest of this nugget here working through these sort of demo topics and get to the point where we've got a vCenter Server up and operational in that virtual machine. So let me go ahead and minimize this, and you'll see here that we have a server. This is the server vc.company.pri, and this server is set up to be our vCenter Server host. You can see here I've got the start menu reduced down here. It's auto-hiding itself because some of the configuration windows get a little large, and so I need as much screen real estate as I can get. If I go up here to Computer, you'll see that I have here on the D drive, I've already loaded up the VMware ISO file, the DVD media. And if I double click this, it'll bring forward the VMware vCenter installer. So what you see here is effectively your standard installer tool that installs some of the products associated with vSphere 5. There's the server here, and the client, and the web client. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then some of the other functionalities that we're not going to work with now, but we will just a little bit down the road. I'm going to focus here on vCenter Server, and you'll notice that I have a couple of different prerequisites over here on the right-hand side. Microsoft .NET 3.5 SP1 and Windows Installer version 4.5. What's interesting, however, about both of these prerequisites, particularly atop Windows Server 2008 R2, which is the operating system that I'm running here, is that neither of these prerequisites are actually invoked or made use of from this location. If I try to install Windows Installer 4.5, you'll notice that the update is not applicable to the computer. And if you try to update Microsoft .NET 3.5 SP1, you'll get a little error message that reminds you that that functionality is actually installed as part of a Windows Server feature. In fact, if I go here to add features, you'll see the .NET Framework 3.5.1 features, which I've already installed. Important note here. If you go about installing .NET Framework 3.5, make sure that you install the top element here, but not the bottom involving WCF activation. Doing so will actually begin installing the IIS role, which will cause a little bit of a conflict later on as you go about installing the actual vCenter stuff. So you'll see here we have both of these prerequisites already installed onto this server. The next step in this process is actually to click the install button and to begin the process of installing the stuff. So at this point, it's going to begin the installation here. It's going through all the Windows installer bits. I will actually pause this recording when we get through the long installation pieces so that you won't have to see, well, the not very fun part as it goes through installing all the pieces that it needs to. But what I do want to do is actually walk you through the installation so that you understand what sorts of screens you're going to be seeing as you go through that installation in your own environment. I'm going to click the next button here on the initial screen, and you'll see I've got the end-user patent agreement that pops up, which requires another next, and then the license agreement for another next. You can put in your username here in an organization. I'll just copy the username down to the organization. And if you have a license key down here, you want to punch that license key down here at the bottom. Don't worry if you don't have that license key. If you don't enter one, it'll install vCenter Server in evaluation mode. And you can always go and add in a different license key at some point down the road. And in fact, inside of vCenter Server, there's a location where which you would add in a permanent license key at some point into the future. Now, as I mentioned, vCenter Server does require a database. You can select any of the available databases that VMware supports, whether it be SQL or Oracle or what have you. If you have a small environment, or if you're planning on a small-scale deployment with a single-digit number of ESX hosts, it's perfectly normal for you to install SQL Server 2008 Express, and in this case, I'm going to be doing that. If you do use an existing supported database, be aware that you're going to have to create a 64-bit system DSN and not a 32-bit system DSN for connecting into that database. Just because it's simpler at this point, we're going to choose the top button here and install the SQL Server 2008 Express instance. We're going to use a system account here with a fully qualified domain name of vc.company.pri. I'm going to choose the next button again and select the defaults here for where to install the vCenter Server components as well as the inventory service components. And then the next button here brings me to whether or not I want to create this as a standalone vCenter instance or if I wanted to join it to an existing vCenter Server group. Now, we haven't spent much time yet talking about linked mode, but what you need to be aware of is that it is possible for you to install multiple vCenter servers into a configuration where they actually connect with each other in a linked mode. Now, doing so is something that you would do actually at this point in the installation. We have in this environment only a single vCenter server, and so we're going to create a standalone vCenter Server instance. But if I had multiple different servers that I wanted to connect to each other, perhaps I have a different team of IT people in some other location that I want to give them the functionality for their local ESX hosts, and then myself in a different location for my ESX hosts, but still have the two working with each other, I could do so using linked mode. I'll choose standalone mode here and choose the next button. I have a number also of different ports that are required for vCenter Server to do the job that it needs to do. Most of these are kind of more or less standard reports for the different protocols that are being used. You'll notice here your HTTP and HTTPS ports are the common ports there, as are your LDAP and SSL port. For the most part, most of us are actually going to just use the default ports here. The only situation where you may be using a different port is if you already have some sort of service or application or technology already existing on the server today. This is a fresh server. It's been just freshly installed. There's no applications on it, so there's nothing to worry about in terms of port conflict. There are some ports also for the inventory service. These are some high-numbered ports here for running those inventory service functions. I'll also choose the default. And then I have to choose a database size here for the Java virtual machine that vCenter Server uses. Now, this is an important determination because you will want to figure out, or at least make an educated guess about what the maximum size of your vCenter environment may be at any point in the future where this vCenter Server is going to be managing it. If you think you're going to go above 100 hosts, you may choose a medium inventory size, or even a large one if you're going to be a very large environment. Or if your virtual machines will grow over 1,000 or 4,000 virtual machines. What this does is it sets aside a different maximum amount of memory for that database. And it's a very important determination for you to make, because once you make this, it's very difficult to change this setting. Now, my environment here is relatively small. We've got a couple of ESX hosts and not that many virtual machines, so I can choose small here. But again, do some very deep thinking here in terms of how big you think you're going to get before you make your selection. I choose the next button here, and you'll see that I have a checkbox down here that before I go and install the program, I have an option to choose how many ephemeral ports are going to be available to vCenter Server. Now, these ephemeral ports are the ports that are above, these are the TCP ports that are above 1024, and a certain number of ports are going to be available for vCenter Server to do what it needs to do. But if you do believe you're going to have the case where you have more than 2,000 virtual machines that will specifically power on simultaneously, well, then you may want to check this box. If you don't think you're going to be able to, or going to need to power on 2,000 virtual machines at the exact same time, you probably aren't going to. In my case, I won't, so I'm not going to go to, but this is yet another one of those checkboxes that you'll want to pay particular attention to if you think the size of your virtual environment is going to get large and you're going to be powering on lots of stuff at the exact same time. Now at this point I'm going to hit the install button, and it goes through all of the installation pieces, of which this can take about 12 minutes or so to complete. So I'm going to pause the recording, and when we come back we'll have a completely installed VMware vCenter Server. And we're back. After about 7-10 minutes or so, we've completed the installation of vCenter Server. Now, what's interesting about this install is that VMware has done what a smart software company has done, and the installation of vCenter Server does not actually install the vSphere client. So if you go to your Start menu after installing vCenter Server, you'll find that there actually is no client with which to be able to interact with vCenter Server. And really, that's a smart thing because, arguably, your server should be doing the server functionality while your client should be on your desktop doing the client functionality. Now you can actually here from the same installer install that vSphere client here. And you'll notice that the client includes the prerequisite again of the .NET 3.5 SP1 and Microsoft Visual J Sharp 2.0 SE edition. So these two prerequisites are required to install that vSphere client. If you click the install button here, that'll actually go and complete the installation. Now I've already done that. I actually did the vSphere client installation while the recording was paused because it's not terribly interesting. There's nothing to see. You just literally click next, next, next all the way through to the end, and there aren't really even any selections or options for you to configure. If you don't want to make this installer available to your users, and that makes complete sense because it just doesn't make a lot of sense for them to have to go to find an installer to actually locate the client, you can actually go to HTTP and the URL of the server that vCenter is installed onto to download that vSphere client from that location. You see here, download vSphere client right here, and that'll actually go through, download the vSphere client. It also provides access to the vSphere documentation. There's a A couple of other tools you can do down here, the vSphere web client here, and the web-based data store browser and the SDK are also available here from this location. Again, this is the location where you just go and download that vSphere client. I have already installed the vSphere client onto this server. So you'll notice if I go to the Start menu and come down here to VMware vSphere client, well, that actually launches the client itself. If I go here to vc.company.pri and then punch in my username and my password and click the log on button, you'll see that this will actually log on to my vCenter server. Now, when I install vCenter Server, it actually creates a self-signed certificate to be used in authenticating the client to the server. Obviously, if you know anything about certificates, self-signed certificates are not necessarily trusted by your client. And so, if your security policy mandates it, you will want to actually install a trusted SSL certificate on your server, a server certificate that prevents this warning from appearing. You can click the View Certificate button here to see more information about this certificate, but what you need to know effectively is that right now you don't actually have a trusted authenticated connection from client to server. You can, however, ignore this error message and just perfectly go right on through from client to server, or install the certificate so that you don't actually get any display warnings for vc.company.pri. At this point, I'm going to ignore the error message and just allow this to complete making that connection between client and server. You'll see here it's loading the inventory and discovering plugins and loading the main form and all the things it needs to do to bring up what is effectively my connection between client and server. So here's the vSphere client. Right? And if I minimize this down here at the bottom, you can see that right now there's not much to look at. I don't actually have any ESX hosts that are connected into this server, so there's really not that much to look at this point. The one thing I do want to make you aware of is this plugins node up here, that if I click and choose Manage Plugins, you'll see the different plugins that are available and installed for this server. Now, 3 are actually installed by default and are ready to be used: the Service Status, Hardware Status, and the vCenter Storage Monitoring Service plugins. A little bit later on, we'll be working with some different plugins that we'll need to install and then make available, which we can do so by right-clicking and choosing the options to enable them and install them. But for right now, we've actually got these plugins ready to go, and there's really nothing to look at this point. Now, we will be using this vCenter server throughout the entirety of the rest of this series, and we'll be going through pretty much all of the different selections here so you can see what each of them do and what they're all meant for. But what we want to do at this point is actually take a look at, instead of the vSphere client, the vSphere web client, the actual server piece that allows you to connect via a web browser to ESX hosts through vCenter server. You should notice here the little important dialog box that reminds you that some new improvements in license reporting require the installation of this client. So just like before, if I hit the install button and then allow it to go through your regular installation process here, this will actually install the vSphere web client to allow me to connect into this server over the web. So if I choose next and next, and then I agree, and then next again, there are some really minimal configurations to be aware of for this installation. Not that much that's really important to look at. The most important of which here is what your HTTP and HTTPS ports are going to be. Now, these 2 ports, as you'll notice, are not the typical HTTP and HTTPS ports, because those 2 ports are already being consumed by vCenter server. So we have to choose different ports here in order to support this web client. And you would not do yourself a favor by switching these to the default ports, because then you would end up with a conflict. So I'm going to keep these selections as the same, hit the next button, and choose the default location for my destination folder, and ultimately install this program. Now let me pause the recording one more time. And once it completes, you'll see that we can actually begin configuring the vSphere web client with the vSphere web client administration tool. Let me go ahead and finish here. I'm going to click the Finish button here because we don't need this anymore. And you'll see it takes us to HTTPS localhost 9443. That's the HTTPS port that we were looking at just a minute ago, /admin-app. Now, this tool is only used to connect the vSphere web client to the correct vCenter server systems, and essentially to register that system with the vSphere web client. If I click the Register vCenter Server button here, I can punch in my vCenter server name, which is 192.168.0.201 in my case, with my username and my password. I'll also need to put in the server name or IP address of the server that's hosting the web client, which in this case is also 192.168.0.201. If I hit register here, you'll see that it completes the registration and I get the same certificate warning, just a little bit different than the one that I saw before. I'm going to ignore this just like I did last time, and it will complete the registration of this server. Here's 192.168.0.201. Now at this point you can see that we've completed the registration of the web client. If we want to actually go and access vSphere, what we need to do is go to this location, 192.168.0.201, 9443/vsphere-client. Just like before, you'll see we have a problem with the website security certificate. That same self-signed certificate is causing problems here. I can continue the website if I want. And this will actually bring forward the actual management console that is roughly equivalent to what you see in the vCenter server and with the vSphere client. Now in this case, I have to enter in my username and password, just like I did before, and log in. Same certificate once again. And this brings forth that management interface. Now, not every single functionality is exposed in this management interface, but most of the important management functionalities are. You can see here is a sort of a welcome screen that tells you, well, all the different things that you need to be aware of here in this vSphere web client screen. Once you've reviewed all the things that it has to tell you here, you can scroll to the right and choose Do Not Show This Page on Startup, and click the X button to bring forward the vCenter Management Console. Again, this is a console that you would want to give to people if you don't want to give them full access to the vSphere client. That vSphere client has all sorts of different functionality that it exposes, and if you're just looking to give someone the minimum of functionality to allow them to create virtual machines and work with their virtual machines and potentially even their hosts, this vSphere web client provides that minimal access for them without having to deploy the entirety of the vSphere client. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've really talked about the introductory topics associated with installing and configuring your vCenter server. You're aware now of what those vCenter server editions are and also the availability options you could put together for making vCenter server highly available. And then we went through the process of installing vCenter server into a virtual machine and showing a little bit about the client plugins, seeing a logon to the vSphere client, and then also the vCenter web client and why you might actually want to deploy this client out to the users in your organization. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.